Hello again. It's, it's coming up to Christmas, so I'm going to do take a bit of a break from the ancient English teaching series to speak about a little of the other things that interest me outside of my religious beliefs right now. So, um, obviously it's that season again. So, my top that my lovely children got me in a previous year. Some time back, I uploaded a video about the generational gap between Gen X and the boomers before them, and our current millennial and zoomers. Since then, I've become aware of how the world of satire and media commentary have started to address the issue similarly. In particular, the arrival across social media of the figure of he's this comedy, sort of stand-up comedy character called Jimmy Brown. Best description of this guy would be, as a character, he's kind of a 80s 90s throwback type um English bloke, sort of very archetypal English bloke essentially. um he sort of almost represents the sort of archetype of the kind of British pub bullshitter, basically. Um, these characters were essentially there to be completely looked down upon and treated with absolute contempt, essentially. You had bands like Oasis addressing these kinds of characters. Um, he does actually do actual music. To go with the other comedy type stuff. Um, the idea is he's kind of a strange blend of Mark E. Smith from the US UK Indie Act 80s US UK Indie Act The Fall, who was notorious for his drunken episodes. He turned quite heavily to drink, especially later in his career. And Robert Smith from The Cure, whose vocal trademarks um, Jimmy Brown borrows quite heavily from for the character. Um, I'll go into addressing the current topic of debate in the online world over who he really is a little bit later in this piece. But first, I just want to address something that I've noticed he does address actually, and so it isn't just me speaking about this. The character, apart from being all the stuff about being a mank when he clearly isn't, and all the stuff about him being uh, having various degenerative diseases, is the fact that he is also, it seems, under the delusion that he is still 19 when, at the very least, he's clearly 45. And this, I realised, was actually quite a bold attempt to actually point out what, especially from that, if you're from that whole uh, crowd of, that whole New Musical Express crowd, who just put these figures like Johnny Marr, Marky Smith, all that lot, Billy Bragg, all these like indie rock darlings from the 80s. They just put them on these pedestals, put crowns on their heads, and just adore them as if they're God. I mean, it makes you sick, really. It really does. Um, and you only have to look at someone like Marr. He's still wearing the same clothes. He still wears the same hair as he always has. Same guitar. He's clearly an old guy. But in his own head, it's like he thinks he's still a 19-year-old teenager or something. And he's not. So that's why I kind of applaud, this fictional character for actually having the balls to say, what are we doing platforming these people when they still think they're kids? I mean, when you consider the kind of youth they want, still listening, then still buying their records, still going to their shows, I'd argue that's something almost actually quite creepy about it, actually. But there you go. So, good on to him for that. So, on to the whole issue of what everyone's talking about online. Is Jimmy Brown actually British as he appears to be, or is he American? A lot of this has been generated by the fact that nearly all of the stuff he does seems to be in Philadelphia. The acts he appears with are Philadelphians. The many of the interviews he appears in initially all seem to be in America. There's not really many British ones. He has been interviewed by some obscure magazine from the north of England. They actually took him into some Weatherspoons or something there, and well, we can't be entirely sure that's a real interview because I mean we don't know if they actually got him. They could have just made the whole thing up, but otherwise most of his interviews seem to be in Philadelphia with Philadelphians. So there's a sense of this is people who he knows. So what do I think? Well, my decision about him is based really on one thing that I think nearly everything else is impeccable about this character, but there's one thing that I've noticed he seems to have slipped up on. Years back, I remember reading a review of some Hollywood movie. I think it was a comedy about alcoholism, and the article was written by this incredibly grumpy, misanthropic American old man, um, who I've never particularly liked very much for the same reason, called Joe Queenan, who wrote about how there is cultural differences between the US and the UK when it comes to alcohol. Now, in I'd say probably the majority of Jimmy Brown's comedy songs, the writing is full of alcoholism as a sort of sticking plaster for his feelings of shame, insecurity, depression, self-loathing. You actually have tracks called I Have a Horrible Relationship with Food and Self-Image. So it's all very on the sleeve, for comedy effect. Now, alcoholism is an issue in the UK. However, in most cases, it's not really for the same reason. See, over here, we just don't have the same issue as the Americans when it comes to alcohol. And the answer is simple, really. In the UK, we never had prohibition. Um, Prohibition was essentially the banning of all alcohol, um, based on the idea of um, the idea that it was a damage to society. Um, we never actually had that here. We had in Britain the temperate movement, which was about trying to get people off alcohol when it started to become quite addictive. Um, so over there, when finally the ban was finally lifted, because it was just discovered that it was just leading to too much, mafia, gangland violence, because everyone was buying it under the counter and the mafia was sort of, providing it. This is the era of, Al Capone and all that, you know. So America finally realised that it was best really to just live the prohibition. But it came with caveats. It was sort of like a go-between thing, Um, they made it you had to be 21 instead of 18 to drink it. So that was that. Um, so over there, alcoholism became culturally known as it was something you did only when you wanted to um, numb the feelings of shame and depression that you had and all that, and guilt. Over here, we've never had that association. Over here, alcoholism has been to do with addictive personality, one. Also, people here drink alcohol because they're addicted to the high that it gives them. It's the idea that it's basically a drug, you know, and, we love drugs, you could say. Um, and that is that is my theory, that's my explanation as to uh, Jimmy Brown being a Philadelphian American, basically, not a Brit. Does this matter? Not really. History is actually full of Americans mimicking quite um, convincingly the British accent. This is Spinal Tap, the movie, which even in America, where it was first released, people were fooled into thinking it was an actual British band. And there are some other cases. So there is a history of Americans mimicking Britons. It is, and I think this is part of that tradition, really. Um, it is a fictional character at the end of the day, so it doesn't matter. I think the important thing is there is that sense of a nostalgia. It's a nostalgic comic act, and I think he makes some very interesting and important points, controversial but important all the same. They need to be made, and at the end of the day, it's a good laugh. So here's to you. It's the new year.